wrote the book for many different reasons, but one of them I can sense is that you wanted evangelicals to have a thick reading of culture, to understand that culture, just to rethink about what it means to be in this kind of thing called culture. We're like fish in water. It's something that we don't even know is there. Can you tell me why you thought that was important? I mean, let's just kind of take a step back and say, why do evangelicals need to know that? Couldn't we just go through life and not sit back and kind of reflect on what it means to be encultured creatures? And why do evangelicals need to know about culture like this? Or what were you thinking? What drew you into this?
Well, I think what I was thinking, was that what I was hearing from Christians when they talked about culture was very thin. I like what you said about thick. And so I was hearing these very thin, simplistic things. For example, I would hear people say stuff about the culture. I'm like, which culture? There's a lot of cultures. Culture is not some monolithic thing. And also, people would talk about the culture as if it were out there, and we're over here somehow outside of it. And that's very simplistic. We're in it. And so people would talk about the church and the culture, and both of those are problems, right? What do you mean by the church? And is the church something you can separate from the culture? And then we had very thin ideas of what it meant to influence culture. So this verb that should not be a verb, impact. It is not a verb. It's a noun. But I would hear so often people talk about impacting the culture. And I'm like, I don't think that's how cultures work. Like, it's not like an asteroid collision, where, one body impacts another body and something moves. That's not how cultures change at all. In fact, cultures are actually designed to resist and deflect impact. Part of the function of culture is to insulate us from the sort of vicissitudes of the world, of the natural world, the terrors of nature, and for that matter, other cultures, the Vikings, in their longboats coming across the strait. And part of what culture does is organize and protect human beings from impact. So when you say, I want to impact the culture, you are basically alerting the immune systems of whatever culture you're trying to impact, and they will mobilize to defend against you. So we were using these crazy language that doesn't actually work and that misleads us. So do we have to think about it? I think, the reason I started thinking about it is people were already talking about it, and they were talking about it in thin ways. The reason we have to think about culture in the way that other people at other times haven't is the rate of cultural change, which is greater now than it was for many other people in human history. The presence of cultural diversity, culture isn't just one thing, and actually to speak of it as if it is one thing is very foolish, especially if you're dominant culture, which I am, white man. For me to imagine that I can just figure out the culture is very foolish. And then the third thing is that a lot of this evangelical preoccupation with culture came from a loss of cultural power. And when 19th century Protestants were running everything in America, which we kind of did, you didn't have to think as much about culture. But once you've been ejected from cultural power, suddenly culture becomes very interesting. So the people who know a lot about culture are people for whom it's changing fast, they are in the presence of diversity, or they no longer have power. And that's why, if you want to know about culture, you shouldn't ask a white male, unless it's a white male who's been willing to learn, which is what I've tried to be, and try to learn about this thing that I could just take for granted.
Very interesting. So I want to hear a little bit more about this ejection from culture.
Yeah.
And I guess, and John, you can jump in here too, but one of the things we've been talking about in this class is theology and issues in contemporary art.
Right.
And if there's one area where Christians have been unanimously ejected, it's in contemporary art.
Right.
As you think about that kind of development where Christianity lost its cultural power, and you think about, I'm going to segue some of these issues with art now, but you think about what's taken place in this particular sphere of contemporary art, immediately what comes to your mind about what's taken place for evangelicals and their relationship to culture, and what has taken place in contemporary art. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on
Wow.
that, or if you ever brought those two together,
Wow.
or how you would see those two relating to each other. But here we have two ejections, so to speak. In many ways,
Right.
this class is, because we've been ejected, we're asking, how can we be
Yeah.
back in this world?
Yes, that's right.
So, yeah. Are there resonances?
Wow,
or
that
things
is
you
so
see connecting?
interesting. There are a handful of cultural movements that I think defined themselves at their origins by distance from Christianity specifically. They were specifically movements to repudiate and resist Christianity. So the discipline of anthropology was basic. There's a lot of good in each of these things, by the way, but the discipline of anthropology was basically founded by missionary kids who had had very complex experiences on the mission field. This would be 100 years ago, roughly, and came back and were so dissatisfied with the models of culture and colonial domination that they saw associated with mission, that they founded this whole alternative discipline, which is why anthropology is still so secular, because at its origins, it was an explicit distancing from another way of seeing cultures as kind of targets for mission activity. And it feels to me like contemporary art, now that you mention it, kind of at its origins was specifically defined kind of to exclude traditional Christian commitments. You guys know a lot more about that than I do. I don't know. But we compounded the problem, right, by getting defensive and Christians, rather than saying, "Gosh, you seem really angry. Tell me about that," like a good counselor, you know. We did not have a non-anxious presence in the face of this ejection. Instead, we got all up in arms and we retreated from engagement, I think. And admittedly, contemporary art also specifically, I think there is a kind of cult of difficulty. Like one of the hallmarks of it is this is supposed to distance the viewer, I think, often. And, you know, Christians, rather than taking people up on that and saying, "Why are you being difficult? What does it mean that you're being difficult? I'm not going to let you be difficult. I'm going to stay with you." Just said, "You're being difficult," and walked out of the museum, as it were. And then we rewarded people who did very, very simple sentimental stuff.
Set ourselves up for that. Yeah. Yeah. At what point do we want to bring the class in? They've all prepared questions. Is this a good spot, or what are you thinking, John?
Soon. I want to.
But first, these guys want their shot.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting about contemporary art, because I agree, it's founded on ejection of
Yeah.
traditional Christianity.
And traditional art also. I mean,
Sure.
not just Christianity, but kind of tradition in some ways, right?
Because they're so
Right, they went together. Yeah.
mutually imply each other. But in a lot of ways, at least following Nietzsche, I mean, Nietzsche's formulation was, in the wake of the death of God, it's the arts that will take over all
Yeah.
of the religious feeling that we still need to have.
Right, right.
That has been housed in religion. So you have this really interesting situation in the arts, I think, where it is perhaps explicitly from the beginning in some ways, this may be more complicated than this, but explicitly critical of traditional Christianity, but also deeply invested in the spirituality and religious feeling of Christianity. So there's this kind of sibling relationship rather than enemy.
No, that's good. That's right, totally.
And I think it becomes quite a rivalry once, as you've described, the kind of defensiveness as we get in defensive posture and privileged, sentimental,
Right.
older forms of art. Not that older forms of art are sentimental. Sentimental and older forms
Exactly.
of art. How about that?
Or sentimentality about older forms of art.
Yes, so there you
Being
go.
sentimental about things that actually originally were not sentimental at all, and were actually sometimes very dangerous and disturbing in their original reception. But now we go and we hear Beethoven and we're like, "Oh, isn't that nice? That's wonderful classical music." That's not how people received Beethoven originally, but now it has attached sentimentality.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so in that context, on the 100 years, 150 years into this, for contemporary artists, for young artists who are very much interested in participating in the arts broadly, visual arts, I think, especially for this class, but music, film, whatever. Do you have any sort of ideas about what components do you think absolutely need to be in place for a young artist entering that sphere of culture, the contemporary art world, today, maybe on the other side of this ejection? That's a massive question.
Right.
It's a sort of open question as well.
Yeah.
You can fill it out in whatever way you want.
Well, I think that the number one thing is a willingness to join a conversation and to actually apprentice oneself to a conversation rather than coming in saying, I'm now going to take over the conversation. So, even what we're doing now, if I just start ignoring you guys and just started lecturing, that would feel very awkward, right? Because this is supposed to be a conversation to some extent. And all the more so, right now I'm the special guest and I wrote a book and, blah, 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 right? But all the more so if someone walks in right now and we're having a conversation and someone who hasn't heard any of it, gets up here and says, excuse me, Andy, if I could just have a moment to address the class, and starts talking about whatever their priority is. Like that would be really awkward. Like we would quickly work to eject that person in one way or another, right? The immune system would be mobilized. We're like, that is not appropriate, what you're doing. And so I think the first thing you have to be willing to do is come in and sit down and, as it were, listen. Now, in the visual arts, that you don't just listen with your ears, you listen with your eyes. You listen by learning a craft. I think that would be a second thing, is actually be serious about acquiring skill. My understanding of the healthiest parts of contemporary art is that it's a phase in the story of artistic expression where the mode of activity or the method is foregrounded. In other words, artists at other times have sought to hide technique. So the best technique is the technique that can't be seen. The brushstrokes that are so fine that you can't distinguish. But now what a lot of art is about the process itself. And the artists I find who are really respected are those who have taken process extremely seriously. And what a lot of Christians run the risk of doing is thinking, I'm here to deliver a message, but without enough attention to the process. So, the other thing that came to mind when you asked, what do you need? You need humility. You need to cultivate a proper sense. That doesn't mean self-hatred or self-denial, self-abnegation. It just means I have a proper sense of myself. I do not have an inflated sense of myself, and I don't have a kind of a self-hating sense of self. Because the art world is so infested with pride, and it destroys real creativity. And I just think Christians have got to come in just truly ourselves rather than trying to get something done there. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah.
Good. Any questions from you all? Follow up to that, or things you've been wrestling with in the book, or in the chapels over the last couple days? Yeah.
And tell me your names as you ask your questions, by the way.
And try to speak.
Brian, great.
You just said that pride destroys creativity, and I agree, but I was wondering if you could maybe open that up a little bit and explain how.
Well, in chapel this morning, I talked about idolatry, and everything starts out working. So initially, pride can be this incredible engine of creativity. And you need, to be an artist, especially in this market and this world, you need ego strength, that's for sure, to do it. But it has diminishing returns, and because what happens is you become more and more preoccupied with yourself and less actually with the work. I'm trying to think of a more concrete example. I wish I had a quick, ready illustration of this. But my sense is that when I'm in a lot of galleries these days, I feel that artists are actually bound by their need to assert themselves. It's not actually a freedom of self-expression. Self-expression starts out seeming very free and ends up being very confining, I think. And the artists who are actually, it seems to me, doing the most sustainably creative work are those who are about something larger than themselves in their art. And they've chosen a medium, a tradition, a craft, or a subject that is bigger than they are. And that's where real creativity is, because it's much more fruitful than just little old me. I don't know if that's totally helpful, Brian, but that's sort of what's lying behind what I'm saying. Yeah.
I wonder also to what extent pride, especially in the art world, is fear based.
Sure.
Driven.
Always.
Yeah. And I wonder about the relationship between fear and creativity.
Yeah, fear it's very hard to be creative in the presence of fear, because creativity comes out of abundance, and fear comes out of a sense of scarcity. And so when you're afraid, you get into fight or flight. And fight or flight is a very narrow and compulsive kind of set of options. Abundance is the sense that there's time to contemplate. So one thing you cannot do when you're afraid is contemplate. In fact, a very good antidote to fear is contemplation. So I fear that something will happen. Well, one way to deal with that is actually to face it and contemplate it, rather than trying to ignore it or avoid it. But a lot of creativity comes from contemplation, really attending to something for a long time. And you can't do that when you're afraid. What people are afraid of, I think, is the extinguishing of the self. They're afraid no one's going to notice me, no one's going to care, or I'm literally not going to be able to eat. That's a reality if you're an artist. My Starbucks job is going to end, but I think most deeply there's this fear that I won't be noticed, I won't be seen. And this is the great resource Christians have, is that we believe we're seen and known by God and held by God, rather than having to get to convince some other person to see and notice and hold me. That's already taken care of for me. Yeah. Others? Everybody had to prepare one, right? So, and we got to get through them all, so let's make it snappy here. Yes? Tell me your name.
My name is Samuel.
Samuel, great.
In your book, the chapter, I think it's called Why We Can't Change the World.
Yeah.
Something that you said really stuck out to me, particularly because I'm a writer, and I heard this same sort of statement before in the seminar I was in. You said making something of the world is of the very essence of who we are meant to be and do. And you meant that in the context of being Christians, correct?
No, actually, in the context of being human beings.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question would be that either as Christians or human beings, where or with who should we try and start making these changes to culture if we wanted to today?
Yeah, where do we start? Yeah, for the sake of the recording. We're making something of the world is what we're meant to do as human beings, as image bearers, I would say. So where do we start? That's such a great question. So I think you start with where you are, what you have, and who you're with. So you start where you are. Where has God, in his providence, placed me? So that has to do with, let's start at it's like concentric circles. What is the family in which I was placed? What's the story of my family? What's the story of the cultural identity of my family? All right, so who am I as a member of my family, as a member of my cultural heritage? Who am I in the town I grew up in, the state I grew up in? You can sort of go out in concentric circles, but the most important things are the most local. So you can't make culture anywhere else than where you are, and you don't need to. Everything starts local, and then what have you got? All right, so that's the next question. What are you going to make something of the world with? Well, it's whatever you've been entrusted with. And that's different for different ones of us. We have different talents, we have different resources available to us, different experiences that we've had. And then, because culture is always made together, who am I with? Who are the people right around me who I could make something with? Now, what people tend to do is they have these ambitions to change the world, which involve leaving behind where I am and going somewhere else. So we moved to LA, even though we're from Podunk. Making culture with things I don't have. So I have to somehow strategically get some other resources I don't have, because I don't have enough. And I want to change who I'm with, because all my friends are a bunch of schlubs, and I want to be with the real talented, popular people. And then we'll really be able to do something. And that, all three of those, I think, are fundamentally idolatrous. They're not receiving the gifts that God has given us to actually make culture in the place we could make culture. I'm not saying you shouldn't go away to school or grow and expand your circle of influence and friends and so forth. And I'm not saying everybody has to stay in their hometown, but the people who make I think the most lastingly beneficial stuff are not alienated from what they started with. And they haven't tried to flee what they began with. Is that helpful? Does that make sense? I think that's very important. I think we all think, if I had some other life, then I could really make a difference. And we don't believe that little old me with the messed up family I came from and the limitations I came from, that God could use that. Like we think we have to flee that. And I don't think that's right.
Can you say a word about how that relates to risk? So
Good question.
There's one thing of starting with what we have, there's another of really risking wisely. How do we do that? Yeah, they're probably not. So there is, there could be a risk-averse way to say, ooh, I'm just going to stay in the place that I know, the stuff I already have, and the friends I'm already comfortable with, and we'll just make something little for us. And that would be a risk-averse way. But the truth is, if I'm honest about where I am, what I have, and who I'm with, there's a lot of ways that, even in that context, I could take a lot of risk, right? But I also think, God God takes Abram out of or wherever he starts out, and calls him somewhere else. So, God can call you beyond where you start, for absolutely. And we need to be willing to go. But that's a little different. God calling you out is a little different from fleeing. It's the difference between Moses killing the Egyptian guy and running off into the wilderness versus God saying, you know what, I'm actually going to take you back to Egypt, and I'm going to lead you out of Egypt. You're not just going to stay in Egypt as a subjugated people, but it's not just fleeing Egypt. You're going to be led out of Egypt. And there's a lot more risk, actually, in the second than in just getting out of town.
I just want to follow up on something you just said, and hopefully this will spur some more questions. But you were talking about not to create fear, so there's no. I don't want to squelch creativity here. But, so a lot of the students, they're going to graduate, and the question is, okay, do I pursue the best MFA? Do I do I need to try to get an article in October, the best,
Right.
peer-reviewed journal? Do I need to just work real hard and get in the best gallery space?
Yeah.
Because this seems to be how it happens for you.
Yeah.
Or then I just heard Andy Crouch, and he said, hey, bloom where you're planted.
Right.
Get your circle of friends. This is a bottom-up kind of,
Right.
let's just kind of make this happen from the bottom up. And which is it? Am I going to go from the top down, go for the top
Right.
I can, and the highest elite position I can, and then shape the world that way? Or do I just need to get my friends? Because it seems like they are probably hearing both messages.
Right.
And maybe they're asking that question. So I
Wow.
wanted to hear you reflect on that a little bit.
So good. To me, the question is, what are you being given? What are you being given? Not what are you grasping? Have you been given at this stage in your life? I don't know October. Is it an important journal? Did you just make that up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's an art
Theory journal.
Art theory journal. No wonder I haven't heard of it. But among art theorists, it's really awesome. So let's just take October, all right? Have I been given a theoretical insight at this stage in my life? Have I been given that to tend and cultivate and develop that I ought to give back in the form of a peer-reviewed publication in October? I should absolutely go for that. If you're given that at 22, you should not shrink back from doing that. If you're given it while you're a sophomore in undergrad, why not? Should I grasp that? Should I try to orient my whole life around stretching beyond my actual capacities at this stage in life to try to grab that brass ring? No, I don't think so. I think that's works, not faith. Where do the real fruitful ideas emerge from? Do they emerge from the people who are trying to grab something? Or do they actually emerge out of local life that ultimately generates something worthy? So I'll give you an example from my own world. This would not impress the readers of October, but in my world, one of the kind of major places to be published is the Wall Street Journal. And people angle and finagle and go to the right parties and all kinds of stuff to try to get to know the editors at the Wall Street Journal, because if you get published there as a journalist, that's a feather in your cap or whatever. The day after Steve Jobs died, I got a call from an editor at the Wall Street Journal saying, we're wondering if you could take this little blog post that you wrote back when he announced his leave of absence in January of 2010, or 10, right? And we'd like you to turn that into a 2-page article for the Wall Street Journal Review on the significance of Steve Jobs. And can you do it by 10 a.m. tomorrow? So I had 24 hours to write 1,800 words on the significance of Steve Jobs. And I had a 700-word blog post, which I had written, and which had gotten a little bit of attention at the time. So by the grace of God, I really mean that, I was free. And so what I did is I took the next 3 hours and prayed. Because I was like, oh my goodness, this is a huge responsibility. And I need to say something. I mean, the man has died. It's not the time to score points about whatever I might want to score points about. I need to honor this image bearer. But this image bearer also represents some things that are troubling in our culture, and I have to write about that. So I took the whole rest of the morning and just prayed. And then I started writing, and at like 10 o'clock that night, I turned in the piece. And on Saturday, it was in the Wall Street Journal. They have this thing called the Wall Street Journal Review on Saturdays. And they have the thing called the essay. And it takes up the whole first page and the whole second page of the review section. This is a massive amount of real estate in a newspaper. I mean, it's more than anybody else gets that issue or that whole week. It was complete grace. Like, it was just gift. And I was able, by the grace of God, to write a very good piece. There's no point in being false humility. It was a very good piece that served their readers really well, did really well. About 6 weeks later, so I could have spent years scraping and scrapping and trying to find out the right phone numbers and pitching pieces and try to get that spot. And instead, it just emerged out of the work that I'd done, being faithful to what I had to do. About 6 weeks later, I got another call from the editors, and they're like, hey, have you heard of this guy named Tim Tebow? We need somebody to write about Tim Tebow. I don't remember what was happening with Tim Tebow at the time. I don't know whether it was the New York Jets or the Denver Broncos year or whatever. It was the Denver Broncos year. And I knew Tim Tebow's name, and I knew that he played football, and that was about it. Now, if I had been grabbing, I would have said, this is unbelievable. Nobody gets to write the review essay 2 times in 3 months. Like, that is a huge opportunity to like establish yourself as a cultural commentator, blah, blah, blah. And I just realized, this is not for me. I was busy that week. I didn't know, I would have had to go to Wikipedia, like just to get up to speed. Like, I just don't follow football, right? And so I said, I don't think I'm the right person for that, but actually I have a friend who just wrote an ebook about Tim Tebow, and you should call him, because he's a great journalist. And Patton got the assignment, wrote the piece, it did great. It actually did better than my Steve Jobs piece, because I looked at the like Facebook likes and all that stuff. I'm like, shoot. And he got on like ESPN, he ended up being on every major sports network, and he's this wonderful Christian writer who wrote a wonderful piece. And if I had been scraping and scrapping to get it, I would have written a barely competent piece, and I would have had one more little line on my resume. And I'm so glad I had the presence of mind, which I would not have had when I was 30 years old. When I was 30 years old, I would be like, oh, yes, yes, please, please. But at 40 years old, I was like, you know what, that's not grace for me to do that. So that's a long answer, but it's just an illustration. You've got to trust that God is at work in your life and in your career. He cares about your vocation. He's not forgotten you. And it's not that he's going to make everything easy, but he will bring fruit out of your life and work. And you do not have to make it happen. I just really believe this. Not that you don't have to work hard, not that you don't have to embrace certain kinds of suffering and risk, but you do not have to grab it. And the people who grab it end up very distorted by their grabbing. And their lives end up burning out very quickly. And I do not want my life to be like that. Other thoughts, questions?
Really briefly, not to hog, but can you say something about the role of contemplation in what you just said, and this emphasis on the local, what you have, what you've been given? What role does contemplation play in that?
One sentence that has shaped my life, it comes from a teacher named Leanne Payne, is, we either contemplate or we exploit. In every situation I'm in, I have a choice between contemplation, which is simply to behold and attend to whatever is in front of me, or to exploit, which is to skip that and just use it for something I think I need. So I actually do, at every moment right now, I've got that choice. So you could ask a question, and I can see, the exploit option is I can be like, ooh, they asked a question, I can tell this story, or I can make this point, or whatever, and I can jump to how am I going to answer the question, or I can try to contemplate who you are, what you just said, what would be the best way to respond to you. So that's sort of life is made up of decisions day after day, and am I going to contemplate this person, this assignment, this work that's in front of me, or am I going to just try to use it to get what I think I need? And contemplation is the posture of faith, I think. It says there's a gift for me in this, even if it's something difficult. And exploiting is the sense, I don't think God is present, and that means I've got to be God in this situation and grab what I need.
I have so many questions. I don't
Yeah, no, stop talking, you guys. Students, help us out, yes. Regina? Yeah. What a great question. That is such a good question. There are two things I think we need a better theology of, that we do not have theological resources of. And one, just to get it off the table, is liquidity. We need a theology of the liquidity of assets, because the biblical world was one where wealth was in the land, but now wealth is in your bank account and you don't even see it most of the time. So liquidity is one, and competition is the other. And this is the other feature of our world that's very distinctive compared to the biblical world. And often when you need a theology of something, it's because the Bible itself doesn't directly address it. You have to do the work to figure out, how do we deal with the pervasiveness of competition? So here's my the way I frame competition. I think there are two kinds of competition. There's competition that emerges fundamentally from scarcity or a sense of scarcity. And there's competition that emerges primarily or fundamentally from a sense of abundance. When competition is in a framework of abundance, it's awesome because it pushes everybody to perform beyond the level they thought they were able to. The best example I know of this is, I don't know if you all have seen the movie Chariots of Fire. It's an old movie. But it's about these two runners, Eric Liddell and, what is it?
It's
Harold Abramson, right? So Harold Abramson and Eric Liddell are the two primary characters in this movie. And the movie is actually about, what is it is competition about grace or about law, as it were, about abundance or about scarcity? And there's this scene early on where Abramson is going to try to run the perimeter of whatever college they're in at Cambridge or Oxford. Sorry, I forget all the details. But there's this square, and if you can run all the way around the square in the time it takes for the clock to strike 12, it's only been done like one time in the history of the college, and he's going to try to do it because he's extremely fast, right? And at the last moment, as he's getting ready, so he's stripped down to his running shorts, and everyone's gathered to see him run all the way around. In the space of just the striking of 12, maybe not quite as big as the square out there. This other more minor character in the movie, who's also a runner, runs up and he says, "I'm going to run with you." And I forget that guy's name, but he's this sort of jolly wealthy guy, whatever, the young lord, right? But he's this fast runner. And so he and Abramson both run, and only Abramson makes it, and the other guy doesn't make it. But he spurs Abramson on to do it. And he does it completely joyfully, and he doesn't mind at all that he doesn't get the prize. He's just doing it for the joy of running and for the joy of kind of accompanying his friend and fellow runner through this moment of athletic achievement. And to me, that's this picture of how competition can be awesome. Like, even when you lose, it can be awesome if what it's about is we are spurring each other on to play better than we would ever play if we were just doing it by ourselves. And that's what the best economic competition is about. And this is the whole idea of comparative advantage, that in a healthy market system, when you and I compete, we discover what we're best at, and we specialize in what we're best at. And actually, because of the way that enhances productivity, that actually creates wealth. Competition, by forcing us to discover where we are most productive, actually, it's not like I get more pie and you get less pie. It's that you figure out that you're better at making pie and I'm better at making cake, and we get both cake and pie. All right? So when it's in an environment of abundance, it's awesome. Where competition becomes unhealthy is when it's built on this idea that you've got to lose for me to win. And not just in this game we're playing, where by definition, if you play a game, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. But in life, like the truth of life is, if for me to get up, you have to go down. And I don't think that's true about the world. I don't think that's a very good world. So when competition is driven by scarcity, I think it's very toxic. What do you think? Give me some.
I was thinking partially about, I visited New York a few years ago.
Yeah.
They're building the memorial.
Huh.
They're talking about building towers that were even taller than the towers.
Yes.
And I like, is that the competition?
Yeah.
What would you think about that?
Yeah.
Us saying we're better than you. I mean, like, it would be kind of odd as a patriot to say, oh no, that's bad competition.
Yeah. You knock down our tower, we're going to build an even bigger tower. We're going to call it the Freedom Tower. It's going to be 1,776 feet tall. Hope they caught that on video. Yeah, that to me is silly. That's silly. I don't think it even, I mean, we could say so much about it. I think you're right to question it. And we've got bigger fish to fry than I can build a bigger tower, you know. And that's not, I do think that is, I think that is, it's nationalistic, it's idolatrous, not in a necessarily, I'm not going to go out and protest it. You know, I've just got bigger issues to worry about. But I think you're right to sense that's not actually the point. Yeah. Yeah.
On the subject of tall buildings,
Awesome segue. Yes, bring it on.
what do you think of like cities and nations always trying to build a taller and taller skyscraper?
Yeah.
And yet like all the rooms and stories in the building are always actually filled with anything useful. It's just so that they're tall.
Yes, right. Because often part of the problem is, architecturally, to go taller, you require more and more internal infrastructure, and it squeezes out the usable space on any given floor. It is definitely diminishing returns. So I almost always think these are kind of two things at once. Image bearing and idol making rarely can be disentangled. And I see the human quest to build things taller, bigger, faster, whatever, as in many ways image bearing. That is, fill the earth, multiply, take this creation, make something of it. Like, I see that as, that's not all bad. But is there also an element of the Tower of Babel? We'll be like God, we will not surely die. By the way, that's exactly what the Babel tower builders are saying to themselves. We'll be like God because it's going to reach to the heavens, and we won't surely die because we'll be able to survey the terrain and ward off attacks. And it's securing ourselves. It's a God substitute. And I just think most human things are both. You can't separate them out into here's the good cultural activities and here are the bad ones. Like, what am I doing right now? I'm taking up a lot of airtime talking to you guys. And hopefully I'm bearing an image, I'm bearing the image of God in some good way. But am I free of idolatry and of, so for instance, wanting you to laugh when I say something I think is funny, wanting to sense that you approve, hoping that you leave and tell people, wow, that was a great class. And that's all totally useless as a motivation or preoccupation. But is that absent from my heart while I'm doing this? No. Am I completely doing this as an idolater? No. It's just a mixture. And that's how I'd look at every human activity. It's a mixture. What else? Yeah?
So then how would your discussion about human culture always being marked by God's grace, how would that tie into this mixture of idolatry and goodness?
So God graciously keeps using us in spite of the fact that we're creating these mixtures, right? And I think what grace means partly is that there's this redemptive, the Holy Spirit is working in history to preserve what was done in an image-bearing way. And the image Jesus uses is the wheat and the tares grow up together, but at the harvest they're separated. But they aren't separated until the harvest. And I think God is going to take everything we do, I think this is what it means to think that culture is in the New Jerusalem, and is going to sort out what in it was image-bearing and what in it was idolatry, and rescue the image-bearing part, and discard and judge the idolatrous part. Just like he'll do that with our lives, right? A lot of my life is going to burn up. Paul uses this image, well, you got gold, silver, precious stones, and then you've got wood, hay, and straw. This fire is going to be applied to the whole thing, and the wood, hay, and straw there'll be a conflagration. But after that all burns away, there's going to be this stuff that's left. And I think God looks at culture that way and is active in history to preserve the works of his mercy, to use a biblical phrase, in spite of ourselves. What else? Yeah.
We've talked a lot about power and
Yes.
about culture making, that a pattern for culture making is about power, but about trust. Could you talk a little bit about trust, maybe, and how you see
Yeah, say another sentence. Like, what do you hope I'll say? Or what do you hope I'll address?
I don't know, just how you would see someone like in our culture right now trusting instead of trying to achieve power.
Yeah. You know it when you see it, to some extent. I'm thinking about Mike Ullman, who is, again, the CEO of JCPenney as of a couple weeks ago. So Mike has been CEO of several companies. He's on the board of Starbucks. And he left JCPenney when this guy, Ron Johnson, came in, who had developed the Apple retail store concept. And Johnson comes in, and interestingly, both Mike, who I know, and Ron, who I don't know, are deeply committed Christians. But Ron comes in with this pretty kind of guns blazing style and is like, we're going to change JCPenney, it's going to become so cool, and it totally did not work. And so he gets thrown out, and Mike comes back in. And so what is striking about Mike is that he's been given in his life these positions of real power. Before JCPenney, he was at LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, the luxury goods brand. And he's had these incredible positions. But when you're with him, you do not sense that you don't sense he's grasping it. You sense he just feels like he's been entrusted with responsibility for thousands of jobs and for the welfare of communities that depend in various ways on these businesses. And I'm not being maybe very helpful, because it would be more helpful if Mike were here. One thing you would see if Mike were here is that he has a visible disability. He has a degenerative nerve condition that makes it very painful for him to walk. In fact, you'll sometimes see pictures of him touring JCPenney stores on a Segway, because it's hard for him to walk around. And so he literally walks. He's literally in pain whenever he's upright. And he has a learning disability. So he's never been able to read easily. And out of these two disabilities comes this man who is holy. Like, he's just present to be with you in whatever situation he's in, and to try to create good with you. And I've been with other people who are in the exact same position, same level, and who are Christians. I'm not saying this about Ron Johnson, because I don't know him, but I've been with other people in this kind of role who don't exude that at all. What they exude is ambition, grasping, self-promotion, self-preoccupation, wanting to make sure the camera's on them all the time. And when you're with those people, you feel more and more diminished. And when you're with someone like Mike, you feel more and more like you have more and more capacity. And when I heard the news that Mike had been brought back by the board, I thought, this is the last thing Mike Ullman wants to do at this stage in his life. He's in his 60s. He has all the money he'll ever need, all the accomplishments. He's actually coming back into a tremendously difficult situation. I mean, the revenue, top line revenue, decreased by 35% in a year. That is a huge delta for a billion-dollar corporation. And I realized Mike is doing this as a servant. Like, he's totally doing it as a servant. Now, does he have a lot of power? Absolutely. I mean, he's been given a lot of power. But it's a trust for him. He holds it in trust rather than grabbing it. So that would be one example.
Andy, last night you talked a little bit about failure. I wonder if you have anything.
If I could talk some more about failure.
I think that might be helpful. Or even the premise. I don't know if everybody was that.
So kind of the premise last night is that all creative endeavors are accompanied by failure. Well, since we're talking about art, theoretically, this is totally true for art. Like, you do not make art without discarding art. No artist, has every single work, comes to the end of every single work and says, oh, another great one, Like, the very essence of apprenticeship actually is repeated failure you fail in more and more interesting ways, basically, as you advance. And so it's especially clear in art making that you have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to, and you've got to be willing to get through the whole process and say at the end, not good enough, and paint over that canvas and start over. And all the great artists do this. And to me, that means we think of like creativity, or we think of success and failure as two ends of a spectrum. Like you're either succeeding or you're failing. But actually, failing is part of succeeding, oddly. So I just finished this book that it will be out this fall. But the process of writing a book is failing to say what you want to say over and over until you finally feel like you said it the right way. And often failing to write. Like many days, I failed to write. I literally never got myself to sit down in front of the monitor with a blank page because it was so intimidating. And I used to beat myself up for this, and I don't think it's particularly healthy, but I've realized this is just part of creativity for me, is being willing to have these humiliating days where Catherine comes home and she's taught 3 classes and done an experiment in her lab and picked up the kids and made dinner, and what'd you do today, Andy? I'm like, procrastinated? But in the end, I have a good book. I don't know if it's a very good book, a good book. And people will say, wow, you write so well, you write so fluently. Like, no. I have written well. I have written fluently. But in the middle of it, I was not writing well. I was not writing fluently. And that's why Mark Twain said, I hate writing, I love having written. Yeah. So failure is part of it. And it's part of, and this is, what makes someone like Mike Ullman a great leader is he does not avoid tackling issues of failure within a company. He does not let things just kind of continue. He goes straight to the problem, and the great leaders go straight to the problem, rather than saying, ooh, I know things aren't really working in that division, well, let's talk about something else. Instead, they go to the problem. And good culture making often comes from going to the problem, rather than trying to evade the problem.
So on the topic of evasion, I was thinking about, you have a section about Christian responses to culture.
Yeah.
And you give like this list of things that basically don't work, and then the solutions that you present. But one of the things you talk about is copying culture.
Yeah.
And how it of itself doesn't really benefit. And I'm wondering if you could, like, for me this kind of interests me because I was talking about Tuesday, he made a comment that you're now, correct me if I'm wrong, the editor for Christian
Right.
Candy Today.
Sure.
Which to me would be kind of a copy culture
Yeah.
of like today. So like I wondered if you could talk more about like, is there a place for Christian fiction, Christian movies, Christian music?
Fantastic question.
Or is it just shouldn't belong? You know what I mean?
Yes. Great question. So, there are these cultural things called magazines, right? But I edit a Christian magazine. Isn't that copying culture? So I think there's a couple things to say. One is, well, in a way, yes. And to the extent that the church, the body of Christ, the cultural expression of the ongoing movement of started at the resurrection, is embedded in culture, it has to use cultural forms. So when the New Testament is not written in some Christian language, it's written in Greek. And the New Testament is not written in a bunch of genres that didn't exist. It's written using letters, using this kind of romantic story. There were these sort of travel narratives that were kind of travel romances, not romance in the sense of, but in the sense of excitement and adventure. And Acts, the book of Acts, is written in the form of a Greco-Roman travel romance. Luke Acts is written in the form of Herodotus's histories and the kind of historical tradition. So they borrowed these genres. They didn't make them up. They borrowed the language. They didn't make it up. I edit a magazine. I didn't make up the form of a magazine. We sing songs. We don't make up the 12-tone scale. So all of that is actually totally fine. The problem with copying is only when it becomes, first of all, it becomes the only thing you can do. In other words, I'm always just waiting for someone else to do something interesting, and then I quickly try to do some Photoshop and make it into a Christian version. It's also a problem when I use it to try to escape responsibility for the wider cultural form. So I only want to write for Christian magazines, and I only want to read Christian magazines, and the rest of the magazine world can go to hell, and is going to hell, but we're creating our Christian version, and it's safe here. That's another thing that when it's wrong, is when it's to be safe for the whole family, right? As if Jesus was safe for the whole family, my gosh. Right? Let alone the Song of Songs or whatever. It's when it's protective, an enclave that eschews responsibility for the wider world. So CT could be a merely subcultural example of cultural copying if it's driven by those things. Or we could be part of a magazine industry where we're going to the magazine industry meetings, not just the Evangelical Press Association, but we're interacting with journalists of all faiths and none. Our writers are writing for those publications. So what's her name? Professor of English at Liberty University, Karen Swallow Pryor, writes for our hermeneutics blog and writes for the Atlantic Monthly's online blog. And we love that. Like, so that's what we want, is for our writers to write as Christians, for Christians, about things that perhaps only in a register that only Christians will be able to engage easily, but we want her to be equally able to write for the Atlantic in a register that non-Christian readers can engage. So it's all about your posture, right? So copying is fine as long as it's not your posture. That would be how I'd approach it. And so, let me just add, I cannot write without writing about Jesus myself. I wrote an article about shaving a few years ago that did pretty well and got picked up a lot of places about the why we shouldn't use these 5-bladed things that Gillette sells, or now it's up to like 9 blades, I think. But you should use a single blade, men. Those of you who shave, I know everyone has beards now, but I shave, and I wrote this piece about shaving, and it ended up being about the gospel. You can read it if you want. It's actually pretty good. It's also about Homer's Odyssey, the Odyssey, and parenthood, and technology, and a bunch of other things. But it ends talking about the Last Judgment, and the Last Judgment as the ultimate close shave. And if I can't write about, it's true, you should assign it. You should read it. It's one of the best things I've ever written. I can't write about shaving without writing about Jesus, but that's because that's my vocation as a writer. Now, my friend, sorry, I have to come up with these names on the fly, who wrote The Blind Countess's New Machine. It's a novel published by Penguin. I cannot recall her name. I will in a second. She has a 2-book deal with Penguin, has written this beautiful first novel. Nothing in it that you would read and say, oh, a Christian wrote this, except it's beautiful, and it's poignant, and it's truthful, and it's imaginative. And that's her vocation as a writer. And we just have different callings. So my friend Sarah Groves writes music that's suffused with Christian worship, and I love it. But then I have friends who write music that has no explicit reference to faith, but is beautiful and moving and engaging, and I love that. Let's do both.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question right now because you guys missed that lull. So get back in the game. We've been talking about art and public space because a lot of artwork is done. A lot of these students might be commissioned someday. Or if you're writing it, it gets put on a blog. I mean, this public space, we are, as Christians, enter into the public arena.
Yeah.
And we do things. We do creative things. And so a language that's been kicked around a lot has been this idea of Christians pursuing the common good. That we not only think in terms of specifically preaching the gospel and seeking to see others come to know Christ, we also want to think in terms of acting in public spaces for the common good. Yeah. And there's a little bit of tension to that. Are we somehow watering down our faith? Are we somehow doing something less than what Jesus has called us for? And in fact, I noticed on the CT website that you have something called In Our City, which is these kind of initiatives where Christians are doing something to bless the city. So can you tell us a little about how Christians should think as Christians about engaging to bless in a more generic way, and maybe even collaborating with people from other faiths to do, good things? Are we just becoming do-gooders and something less than Christians when we do that?
Right. Great question. So let's see. If you're going to make culture, you have to collaborate with people. If you're going to make culture that serves a culture that is pluralistic and diverse, you're going to have to collaborate in a pluralistic and diverse way. If just Christians collaborate, in all likelihood, the culture we create will mostly or only affect our community. You have to collaborate. So the question then is, how do we collaborate? And I find this language of the common good really helps. And it's not just a phrase. It has a whole weight of Christian thinking behind it, because it's a phrase that comes out of Catholic social thought, as it's called. And the definition of the common good, if you take it seriously from Catholic social thought, this is my way of putting it, because I'm a journalist, so I make things simpler. The Catholics make it more complicated. If you are feeling like an insomniac, I suggest reading some Catholic social teaching, because it will put you to sleep. But it's very powerful stuff, very profound stuff. And the way I summarize it is, the common good is about the flourishing of the vulnerable in community. It's about flourishing. It's about especially human flourishing. Societies that are built around the common good make it possible for human beings to flourish. It's especially about the flourishing of the vulnerable, the people who least would be at most risk of not flourishing. And the way the vulnerable flourish is by being put in healthy, vibrant human communities. So when we go to partner with our neighbors in La Mirada or whatever, I think we go and we say, how can we contribute to flourishing here? Who is vulnerable here that especially needs the attention of the society to flourish, the attention and intention? And what kinds of community do we need to create so that'll happen? Is that watering down our faith? I don't know. Is it? It is if you reduce your faith to that. If you decide, you know what, we don't really need Jesus for the vulnerable to flourish. Actually, the vulnerable can flourish in purely secular communities. In fact, it would be better if we just let the state provide those communities. Like, that would be really the right way to do it. Well, yes, that would be watering down your faith. That would be communism, right? But the common good was articulated by Pope Leo XIII specifically to resist communism and to say, no, there's a better vision for human societies, and it requires a Christian vision of what a human being is, ultimately. So it all depends on why you're adopting it, I think. If you're reducing your public presence to just the minimum we can agree on, then I think that's a problem. But if you are going to your neighbor and saying, you are a fellow image bearer, you care about flourishing, you care about the vulnerable, what could we build together? I'm coming as a Christian. I don't see how that's watering anything down. Now, that being said, if we come to think, the Christian faith is kind of dispensable here, and what's really important is good people doing good things. Well, now you're no longer a Christian, because the Christian faith is not about good people doing good things. It's about a good God rescuing people who on their own won't flourish, won't care for the vulnerable, and will end up separating from one another, rather than coming together. It's only by the grace of God that the common good happens, from our point of view. And if our neighbors don't know it's the grace of God, that's one thing. But if we stop believing it's the grace of God, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's where, just to interject on that, we've also been talking about common grace, that
Right.
God is also at work in culture.
Exactly.
And God cares about the flourishing of culture. He
Exactly.
And so maybe we put some good Catholic social teaching along with some good maybe Reformed common grace. And we can see these two meeting.
Exactly.
Christians participating.
So we just see what it is to be Christian is I don't believe there's a secular realm. That is a world that is outside of the agency and activity of God. I believe God's at work in the world. That's what it is to be a Christian, I think. And so when good things happen that lead to genuine human flourishing and the flourishing of the whole cosmos, especially when the vulnerable flourish, I say God is at work. By his mercy is at work in that culture. One more. Yes?
So, I think this conversation is just fascinating and lovely, but I really feel like,
Yeah.
But I really feel like it's only going to happen within certain circles. Like, I've been a Christian for 2 years, and this is the first time I've ever heard anything about contributing culture
Wow.
to my faith. And so,
Yeah.
I guess my question is, what is your number one way to try and get this into our community as
Wow.
Christians? And that's a huge question, and it's okay if it's really difficult to explain.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, that it's amazing how new and unfamiliar these themes are, especially when I think when you reread the Bible and realize it's a cultural story from beginning to end in many ways. It's about human beings making something of the world, what went wrong in that, how God's intervened in history. History is just culture over time, right? It's the story of culture changing over time. Why have we not heard this? And how can we get this more on the agenda? What's my number one strategy? I wrote a book. Well, my number one strategy is always to start with what I've got. So,
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you think it comes from each individual person doing their part and letting other people know about this reality? Do you think it starts from that micro level, or do you think it's more of a meta thing where we need like our pastors to be preaching about it and we need to have much more of a larger discourse?
yeah, it's both. You know, in a way, you're asking a more fundamental question, which is how does culture change? And if we want to change the culture, say, of our own Christian community, which is a culture, how is that going to happen? And, you know, there's a grassroots aspect to it, and there's a grass tops aspect, you could say. And when culture changes, it's almost always because you get certain kinds of elites, we use this word just to mean people who have extra influence, who invest in change. But actually, it always also comes up from people who seem to not have a lot of extra influence, in my experience. So I would not say individuals, just because I don't think culture is ever done by individuals. So you got to find some friends. So the first thing would be to find a couple people who care about this. And I'd do have you read the 3:12-120 chapter yet? The community chapter? So that will answer your question. All cultural change happens in circles of 3 people, 12 people, and 120 people. And I talk about this in the chapter called Community. So I would find 3 people who care about it and start thinking, how could we bring these themes into our circle and get 12 people involved? And then how could we get 120 people involved? Now, does there also have to be some attention to the people who have, you know, get little mics put on them and, you know, talk a lot? Yes. And that's really also a matter of 3, 12, and 120. It's a matter of, you know, starting small and building. And that's what some of us are trying to do, and it's changing. It really is changing. This is not the last you'll hear of it, let's put it that way. So I would just encourage you to not worry too much about the grass tops. Do what you can, and you'll find actually, you know, those who are given a little, and are faithful a little, often are given more, and you get more chances to see it grow. It's going to grow.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.